I have the honor of talking also a little bit in this webinar and about field studies as an evaluation method in design-based research. So Lorena has already talked about the main interest of design-based research as being in figuring out you have designed something, you have created something that you think is cool, and now you want to know whether it works. So you as a researcher are in the situation you have developed something magic, something really cool. Yeah, you have a magic wand, an intervention that will solve some huge problems in technology enhanced learning or in whatever. And you are interested in the question, what will it do to real users in the real environment? This is essentially the question that you can answer with field studies. When you have designed something and when this is the question that you're interested in, then field studies are a good idea. Yeah, so field studies means that you have your intervention, you have developed something, and now you want to go into the field and you're interested in knowing how will this affect real users in their real environment. And so first, also the limitations. So this question or this field study as an evaluation method is not applicable for all in all research setups. I think this has become very clear already in the first part of this webinar. So the point is that it is only applicable if the overall research approach is to develop a solution for something and to combine research and impact on practice, as it is the case in design-based research or in similar types of research like action research, for instance. And it's applicable if the perspective on technology is to understand technology in combination with people and their social context or activities. It could also be that you have technological or algorithmic research questions. And in this case, if it isn't going to help you so much, maybe you need to have ecologically valid data from people or from real world context. That could be the case. But essentially, a field study's strength is that you evaluate, that you see how something works in a rich and sometimes very fuzzy and messy context. So and this should be also in the focus of your research for a field study to be appropriate. So typical theories that take this stance are activity theory, for instance, which is a widely known and sociocultural theory used in human-computer interaction and also in the learning sciences, or socio-technical systems theory, which is maybe a little bit more known in information systems related research. So field studies in principle answer the question, does the developed technology and IT artifact work? And we're going to discuss in a little bit what this working means. So what is the qualities that we are looking for as part of a socio-technical intervention in the selected environment. And I would like to say one more word why I'm highlighting here that as part of a socio-technical intervention. When you put sufficiently novel technology, and in research, this is typically what you're trying to do. When you put sufficiently novel technology into a field study in a real environment, then you're not just adding some new technology, some new tool, but you're also introducing or making necessary a new way of doing things, a new way of working, of learning, of teaching, a new way of communicating. And so therefore, the intervention as a whole that you're, what's the disruption that you're giving to this environment in which you're studying your intervention is really a socio-technical intervention. It's not only a piece of technology, you're also introducing or making necessary a new practice in the environment you have chosen. So when not to do a field study, there's of course also a number of good reasons not to do a field study. So when your technology is immature, then a field study isn't the place to test this. You will frustrate users, you will have a lot of effort, and you're basically just going to find bugs that you could have found in much cheaper ways by systematic testing or even by usability heuristics or by very quick and informal pilot studies that also evaluate and assess your early prototypes. So immature technology, and this means both from a usability and from a technological perspective, are not suitable for field studies. Don't do that. Invest the efforts in earlier pilot studies. As I said, you will burn a lot of resources on your end, and you will also burn your users, meaning they will be frustrated, and they will probably not be so easy to convince to try a more mature prototype again. And then, as we said before, if the research question is of technological nature Or in general, if the research question really isn't about people acting in complex contexts, then field study isn't appropriate. But let's say you have decided that you have this magic wand and you want to see whether it really leads to learning. Yeah, you want to give this magic wand to people in a classroom, and you want to see whether people really learn better if they're holding it in their hands, if they're using it. So the question is, what do you want or need to measure in a field study in order to test the learning intervention? So I'm here assuming that we are working in technology enhanced learning. You have some kind of technological artifact and you want to evaluate it. I'm not even going here into the question of how to measure learning in general, but about building a chain of evidence. The problem is field studies are expensive. It takes a lot of organizational effort to set this up. You need to coordinate with the users. You need to make sure that the technology works. You need to care about the scheduling of the research team and of all the practitioners. You also don't want to disrupt the routines of your learners too much. So everything needs to fit together. And this is really a lot of administrative organizational effort to set up. Field studies are also messy. Something always goes wrong. So I have carried out several, or a lot of, I don't know, a number of field studies, let's put it like that, and something always has gone wrong, or let's put it that way, differently than planned. So there's always something that goes off into some direction. And then field studies per se don't allow you to show causality. And the main fundamental reason is that in a field study, there are so many factors that are not under your control. Who really participates, whether the people are really just motivated. Maybe there's something that on another end that has just frustrated or inspired the whole class or the whole group of learners you are working with. There are really a huge number of factors. And even if you have a research design that in principle would allow like an A/B test that in principle would allow to say something about causality, in very many interventionist field studies, you will not have the number of participants that will allow you to have a confidence in making such a statement. And so what you want to measure is much data and exactly the data to be nearly sure that whatever happens, you get useful results. And useful to a researcher very often means publishable, but it could also be useful in the sense of data that allows you to debug, to find out what actually went wrong. So you don't want to only measure the learning. So if I put a magic wand in a classroom and then I do a pre and a post, and ultimately it appears that students have really learned something in the 2 weeks they have used this magic wand, you know, I really cannot make the statement that it was the wand because I don't know whether students used the wand. I don't know what else they did. I'm not capturing anything of the experience. I'm just capturing in two times, and I have no idea or control what exactly happened in the meantime. And this is because it's not an experiment where I control everything in between the two test points, but it's a field study where a lot happens between these two test points. And so I want to have a chain of evidence that allows me to say, you know, this wand was designed in a way to support learning. I need to be able to make an argument. Then I need to be able to show that the students actually used the wand. Then I need to have maybe some intermediate measures that show intermediate experiences, subjective insights, any kind of rich observations from throughout the field study that make me see exactly what happened through the field study. And then, of course, I maybe also, or I definitely also would like to see a result. And this actually helps you to be able to figure out what happened, because chances are high, or chances are there, let's put it like that, chances are there that you're putting the magic wand in the classroom and some students will have learned something in the meantime and some students won't. And then you have a result that is not publishable, and it's also a result that maybe doesn't tell you anything. And so you need this chain of evidence in order to debug, to go back to the place where everything went wrong or where something didn't go as you intended it to go, so that you yourself can figure out what you need to do better the next time. And so the solution that I'm going to, I don't know, present or suggest or propose here is to use a hierarchy of evaluation dimensions. And this was not my idea. So I was hugely inspired when reading Kirkpatrick and Kirkpatrick's work, where they proposed these 4 levels of evaluations originally for evaluating trainings in organizations. And this is in many ways exactly the problem that you're facing in field studies. You have some intervention for learning. Learning is already inherently hard to measure. And then you're entering a chaotic situation where a lot can happen. And so this hierarchy is what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. There's an additional advantage, and this is that so this hierarchy allows for debugging and for the identification of preliminary results. If the first field study didn't get you until really reaching your goal, it allows you to build a chain of evidence. And you can use evaluation criteria or methods from different fields of knowledge. So maybe if you're measuring the reaction of users to a technology, you can use methods and measures from HDI. If you're going towards learning, you can use a lot of the methods and instruments from learning sciences. Behavior, you again might be able to go more into behavioral psychology. And if you want to measure results and impact in some settings, you want to measure that at an institutional level, and then you might be able to take instruments and tools from management sciences, for instance. This hierarchy also allows you to move through different perspectives of what success, of what good take up, what an efficient socio-technical intervention for learning actually is. So at the level of reaction, we're asking simply the question, how do users react to the intervention? Do they actually, I think I should have turned around the bullet points here. The fundamental question is, do they actually use your intervention as you in principle intended them to use it? Do they use it at all? Do they use it regularly enough? Are they compliant with your instructions for the field study? You can also ask about the perceived usefulness, about the usability, about sympathy, whether users actually like doing your intervention. We know that that liking and sympathy isn't the same as actually learning something, as efficiency for learning, but still we know that that emotions can help learning. So typically we as learning designers and engineers want to design something where students have a positive learning and user experience. So this is really the basis. So if users don't use or comply with your intervention, it cannot have an effect. So it could be that you're seeing a good result at another level, but then you don't have your chain of evidence here. And this fundamental level also helps interpret weird effects or results at other levels. You could use, for instance, ease of use and perceived usefulness as prediction of technology acceptance following the technology acceptance model, which I also referenced here. I found also that to be very useful in own past research. And then at the level of learning, what you want to do is you want to assess gained knowledge and competences. This is very often in learning sciences the level at which you want to measure an effect. So ideally, you have good quality tests in the domain of learning where you can do pre and post tests that measure the knowledge in a domain. You can also observe participants. You can use self-reports of knowledge. And this is the more important if you go into niche domains of learning where you don't have standard tests for knowledge available. The rationale is, of course, that gained knowledge and competences very often are the goals of an intervention. When your goal is actually kind of behavior change or the competence to actually do something, then it's important to figure out what knowledge and competences people learned, because in many domains a change of behavior is unlikely if you haven't changed any insights. So you could simply train for very menial skills, but very typically we see here a connection. And in this case, if you're seeing problems at the level of learning, you could here maybe identify a disconnect between the conscious learning and the unconscious learning that directs, or the unconscious learning that directs the behavior. At the level of behavior, you measure relevant aspects of behavior, and ideally, again, you have quantitative tools for measuring behavior. For learning, you could also use observations and self-reports, however. And at this level, it's already much more difficult in field studies to have useful, complete accounts for complex behavior. The more finely defined and the more granular the behavior is that you want to observe, the easier it is. But for complex behaviors like behavior in conflict solving, for instance, it's not so easy to fully capture that, and it's not so easy to assess that. The challenge in research is that whenever you have an intervention that actually targets behavior change, behavior is not easily changed in short-term interventions. And I think we can even abbreviate this sentence to behavior is not easily changed. Okay, so people don't so easily change their behavior. So when you're doing a field study for a week, for 2 weeks, or for 4 weeks, chances are very high that you're not going to see behavior change. At the level of results and impact, sometimes you really have performance measures that go beyond measuring gained knowledge or changed behavior at a fine granular level, but you really have performance. And performance could be final tests, it could be athletic performance, it could be in professional learning, individual sales. So with performance, with results and impact, we're really looking at those measures of success that ultimately define how successful someone is. So a measure of success in school or in academia typically are the final exams. We could say if we have an intervention and we're doing pre and post tests of knowledge, and people learn a lot, that is all very nice, but ultimately we need to see the performance at the end of the year, because this is how people will be graded. This is what will define ultimately their academic career. Yeah, any intervention that ultimately does not lead to better grades, if that is the goal, isn't effective as such. We could say, okay, at least it doesn't lead to better grades, but to a better psychosomatic well-being. That's very nice. And if that was the goal, that's also great. But we need to be sure what is really the measure of success outside this intervention study. Sometimes also the organizational performance is relevant. So I think here we would need an example more also from the education system. So sometimes I was thinking here rather of professional learning. So in hospitals, it is very nice if physicians learn something, but ultimately an organizational performance measure is the mortality rate of the patients. So that is the hard measure of whether any kinds of trainings, any kinds of knowledge input actually works. The same for consulting or for project-based companies. The project profit margins are what is ultimately interesting. Very often you can also redefine your points of measures. And the same we see at universities or at schools. We have organizational performance measures, and at universities, for instance, dropout rates or active students are key performance indicators in Austrian universities, for instance. I don't know what in other countries are maybe organizational or institutional performance measures. In Austria, sometimes we're talking about measures also like average performances of the school in relationship to socioeconomic status of the students, and so on and so forth. So the important thing is here to think that at the results and impact level, it's not always your task as a researcher to really show the impact of research on some wider goal, but I think it is helpful to see and to recognize that there are performance measures for individuals and for institutions that rest outside of your own research. There are performance measures that are interesting to know about, because at least conceptually, you can think of how your intervention contributes to these goals. So the rationale, of course, is to evaluate at a mid-level whether the right things have been learned, where the right is not defined by us as researchers, but by the context. So we all live in a social context that defines what is valuable to learn, and that is as true in academic situations in the school system as it is in work life. Thinking about this result and impact level also helps us identify the value of the learning towards the learner, but also towards other stakeholders who maybe pay for your research or who would maybe pay for the research outcomes for the intervention. The challenge is, of course, that performance is, of course, caused by a multitude of contributing factors. So causality is very hard to ascertain with a short research intervention. And so sometimes you will end up having to just show conceptually that there is a connection between your intervention and the results or the impact that is desirable for the individual or for the organization. Yeah, and then the question is, I think we touched on this question already a little bit in the beginning when the question was, how do you actually carry out the analysis? And the same goes for the evaluation in the field study. So you gather data really by a mix of methods. You observe in person, you collect interaction data, you also just ask study participants and stakeholders around them. You maybe access existing data that is collected via the environment in which learners exist. Therefore, you gather quantitative and qualitative data. And sometimes it may even be possible to compare. So pre-post is often done in field studies, and depending on the setup, so I think from MOOC studies were by now used also seeing A/B tests really between subject tests, also in field studies, because there you have larger numbers. So this is typically very difficult to do in classroom settings, except if you really have access to many schools and many classes where you can do that. Many thanks for listening to me for such a long time without interruption.